Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at her empty bank account. Just hours ago, she had transferred her entire life savings, $149,000, to help her grandson out of what she thought was a desperate situation. The voice on the phone had sounded so much like him, scared and pleading for help with a financial emergency. She hadn't hesitated for a moment, but now, as her actual grandson's confused voice echoed through her phone speaker, asking about her day as if nothing was wrong, her world crumbled. The devastating reality hit her. She'd been scammed, yet as tears welled in her eyes, something else stirred within her, a fierce determination. This wasn't going to be another sad story about a vulnerable elderly victim. Margaret was going to hunt down the people who did this to her, and she was going to get her money back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate shadows across Margaret Wilson's kitchen table. At 72, she maintained a routine as predictable as the grandfather clock in her hallway, a wedding gift from 38 years ago, still keeping perfect time. She stirred her morning tea, Earl Grey with a splash of milk, just as she had done every morning since Robert passed away 5 years ago. The kitchen gleamed with well-maintained 1990s appliances, each surface spotless from Margaret's daily cleaning routine. A collection of magnets dotted the refrigerator, holding photographs that traced her grandson Tommy's life from infancy to his recent college graduation. Her favorite showed him at age 7, missing his front teeth, proudly holding up a fish, nearly as long as he was tall. Robert had taken them camping that weekend, teaching Tommy to fish just as he had taught their own son, James. Margaret checked her watch, a slim gold timepiece that Robert had given her on their 30th anniversary, and smiled. Tommy would be calling soon. Every Tuesday at 10 a.m., as reliable as her grandfather clock, he called to chat about his week and listen to her stories. These calls had become even more precious since James and his wife moved to Seattle for work. 3 years ago, leaving Tommy to finish college on the East Coast, the doorbell chimed, interrupting her reverie. Through the window, she caught sight of a familiar silver-grey bob. Betty Morrison, her best friend of 20 years and former detective with the local police department, stood on her porch, clutching a newspaper and what looked suspiciously like fresh-baked scones. "I thought I'd join you for Tommy's call," Betty announced as Margaret opened the door. "Plus, Mrs. Henderson at the bakery had a new batch of those orange cranberry scones you love." She held up the paper bag with a knowing smile. Margaret welcomed her friend inside, setting out an extra teacup. Betty had been her rock after Robert's passing, showing up with baked goods and practical advice in equal measure. The former detective's sharp mind hadn't dulled in retirement. If anything, she seemed to approach everyday life with the same analytical precision she'd once applied to solving crimes. "How's the nest egg growing?" Betty asked, breaking a scone in half. She knew Margaret had been saving diligently since Robert's insurance money came through, determined to leave something substantial for Tommy's future. "Just hit 149,000, Margaret replied proudly. "Not bad for a retired librarian, wouldn't you say?" She'd always been careful with money, clipping coupons and comparing prices, treating her savings account like a garden that needed constant tending. Betty nodded approvingly. "Robert would be proud. You've always been the sensible one. Remember when I almost bought that timeshare in Florida? You talked me out of it just in time." Their conversation was interrupted by the cheerful trill of Margaret's phone. Tommy's smiling face appeared on the screen. She'd finally learned how to set up caller ID photos last month, with Tommy's patient guidance over one of their Tuesday calls. "Right on schedule," Betty mouthed, reaching for another scone as Margaret answered the phone. "Grandma!" Tommy's voice came through clear and warm. "I've got big news. Remember that software development internship I applied for? They called this morning and..." Margaret settled into her chair, cradling the phone, as her grandson's excitement bubbled through the speaker. These were the moments she lived for. Tommy's achievements, Betty's friendship, the security of knowing she'd built a stable future for herself and her family. Her life might be simple, but it was rich in all the ways that mattered. As she listened to Tommy describe his upcoming interview, Margaret caught Betty's eye. Her friend was solving the newspaper's crossword puzzle, occasionally mouthing answers. She'd discovered the morning sun continued its journey across the kitchen floor. The grandfather clock marked the passing minutes, and Margaret felt utterly content in her orderly, predictable world. She had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, that world would be shattered by a single phone call. The call came at 8:47 the next morning. Margaret was watering her African violets, Robert's mother's prized plants, when her phone rang. The screen showed an unfamiliar number, but she answered anyway, a habit from her librarian days when parents would call about overdue books from unknown lines. "Grandma?" The voice was shaky, frightened. "Grandma, I need your help." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Tommy? Is that you, sweetheart?" "Yeah, it's me." A sob caught in the throat on the other. "And I messed up, Grandma. I messed up really bad, and I don't know what to do. I'm not supposed to be calling anyone, but I had to reach you." She set down her watering can, hands already trembling. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No, I'm in jail." The words came, out in a rush, followed by another choked sob. "There was an accident. I wasn't drinking, I swear, but they found an empty beer can in my car from last weekend. Someone ran a red light and I couldn't stop in time, and there was a pregnant woman in the other car." Margaret sank into her kitchen chair. "Oh, Tommy." "She's okay. They both are. But they're keeping me here until I can post bail. The lawyer says if I can get out today, before they file formal charges, he can probably get them dropped. He says he has proof the other driver was at fault. But if this goes into the system," another sob. "My internship, Grandma. The background. Check everything I've worked for." The voice sounded different somehow, congested maybe, or just distorted by stress. But it was close enough to be her Tommy, terrified and alone in a jail cell. "How much do you need?" The words came automatically. Margaret was already reaching for her purse, for the file where she kept her banking information. 149,000, he rushed to explain. "I know it's a lot, but it covers the bail, the lawyer's retainer, and the initial settlement to keep her from pressing charges. The lawyer says if we move fast—" "I have it," Margaret interrupted. "I have exactly that amount. This is why I've been saving Tommy, for emergencies. For family." Relief flooded the voice. "Really? Oh God, Grandma, thank you. But listen, this is really important. You can't tell anyone. Not Mom and Dad, not even your friend Betty. The lawyer says any communication could complicate things legally, and you have to do it right away, before they process the paperwork." Margaret was already pulling up her online banking. "Of course, sweetheart. Tell me what to do." The next 20 minutes were a blur of instructions. The voice, Tommy, walked her through every step of initiating a wire transfer, directing her to send it through a specific service to an account that would allegedly be managed by the lawyer's firm. He even knew about her savings account, the one she'd mentioned to Betty just yesterday, which only confirmed in her mind that this was really Tommy. "Remember, Grandma, not a word to anyone. I'll call you as soon as I'm out." The voice had steadied now, calmer with the solution in sight. "I love you so much. Thank you for always being there for me. I love you too, sweetheart. Everything will be all right." Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks as she completed the transfer. After hanging up, she sat in her kitchen, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, marking each moment of her anxious wait. She wanted desperately to call Betty, to ask her friend's advice about legal matters, but Tommy's warning echoed in her mind. No communication. It could make things worse. Outside her window, a pair of cardinals landed on her bird feeder, the yai one Tommy had helped her set up last summer. The female pecked at the seeds, while the male stood guard, just as they always did. The familiar sight calmed her somewhat. She had done the right thing. She had helped her grandson when he needed her most. The African violets sat forgotten on the windowsill, their leaves still dry, as Margaret waited by the phone. She imagined Tommy being released, imagined the relief on his face. He was a good boy, always had been. This was just a terrible mistake, and she had the means to fix it. That's what grandmothers were for, wasn't it? She glanced at her phone, screen every few minutes, willing it to ring with news. The savings account she'd tended so carefully was now empty, but money could be earned back. Tommy's future, that was what mattered. She remembered his excited voice just yesterday, talking about the internship. They couldn't let one accident destroy everything he'd worked for. The clock struck 10, then 11. Margaret made herself a cup of tea, but couldn't drink it. The cardinals had long since flown away. Her phone remained silent. At 11:42, it finally rang. Margaret lunged for it, nearly knocking over her cold tea. But it wasn't Tommy's number on the screen. It was the real Tommy, calling right on schedule, just a day earlier than usual. "Grandma!" His voice was bright, cheerful, normal. "You'll never believe what happened at the internship interview." The teacup slipped from Margaret's numb fingers and shattered on the floor. Earlier that morning, before her world collapsed, Margaret had sat in her silver Toyota Camry outside First Regional Bank, rehearsing the story she'd been instructed to tell. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. "Home renovations," she whispered to herself. "Kitchen and bathroom remodel." The lawyer, or the voice claiming to be one, had been very specific about this part. Inside the bank, the familiar faces of the staff offered no comfort. Sarah Chen, the teller who had worked there for the past 5 years, greeted her with the usual warm smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson. How are you today?" "I need to make a wire transfer," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "For home renovations." Sarah's smile flickered slightly. "That's a significant amount, Mrs. Wilson. Would you like to speak with our manager first? We've been seeing an increase in various scams lately, especially targeting—" "It's for home renovations," Margaret interrupted, perhaps too quickly. "I've been planning this for months." The lie felt bitter on her tongue. She'd never lied to Sarah before. Another bank employee, James Miller, appeared at Sarah's shoulder. "Mrs. Wilson, for transfers of this size, we typically recommend a 24-hour waiting period. It gives you time to verify everything, and I need it done now." Margaret's voice cracked slightly. "The contractors are waiting." She could almost hear Tommy's voice in her head, scared and alone in a jail cell. Every minute counted. James and Sarah exchanged a look that Margaret would remember later, in her darkest moments of regret. They knew. They had tried to warn her, in their careful professional way. "Could you at least call your son?" Sarah suggested gently. "Just to confirm the renovation plans?" But Margaret was already shaking her head. "The paperwork is all in order." She pulled out the account details. She'd written down, pushing them across the counter with trembling fingers. The process itself took less than 10 minutes. A few signatures, a few clicked buttons, and her life savings, carefully accumulated over decades of budgeting, saving, and Robert's insurance money, vanished into the digital ether. Sarah handed her the receipt with noticeable reluctance. "Mrs. Wilson, please keep this receipt safe, and if you have any concerns later, any at all, call us immediately. Sometimes these transactions can be reversed if we act quickly enough." Margaret barely heard her. She was already thinking about Tommy, imagining him being released, imagining his relief. She tucked the receipt into her purse without really looking at it. The drive home felt surreal. She passed the grocery store where she diligently compared prices every week to save a few dollars. The cafe where she and Betty met for coffee, always ordering from the senior menu to save money. The library where she'd worked for 30 years, carefully building her pension. In her driveway, she sat, with the engine off, watching the numbers on her phone, waiting for Tommy's call. The morning sun crept higher, warming the car until she had to crack a window. She didn't know then that she was sitting in her car waiting for a call that would never come. Didn't know that at that very moment, her real grandson was preparing for his internship interview, straightening his tie in a mirror hundreds of miles away. Didn't know that Sarah Chen was filling out an incident report, documenting her concerns about what she suspected was another elder scam. The receipt in her purse felt as heavy as a stone. The shattered teacup lay in pieces on Margaret's kitchen floor, Earl Grey seeping into the grout between the tiles. But she barely noticed the mess, barely heard Tommy's voice still chattering excitedly through the phone about his interview. "Grandma, are you there? I think I dropped something." "Tommy," she whispered, her voice raw. "Tommy, where are you right now?" "At home, getting ready for my interview. Remember, I told you about it yesterday. You're not in jail." The words came out strangled. "Jail?" Tommy's voice shifted from confusion to concern. "Grandma, what are you talking about? Why would I be in jail?" Margaret's legs gave out and she sank to her kitchen chair. The morning's events rushed back at her like a tidal wave. The desperate phone call, the wire transfer, the elaborate story about bail and lawyers and a pregnant woman in an accident. Her free hand clutched at her chest, where her heart was, hammering against her ribs. "Someone called," she managed. "They sounded just like you. They said you were in jail, that you needed bail money, $149,000. Saying it out loud made the amount feel even more enormous, even more devastating. "Oh, God," Tommy's voice cracked. "Grandma, please, tell me you didn't." "I sent it." The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. "I sent everything." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Tommy spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I'm calling Mom and Dad. Then I'm catching the next flight home. Don't move, don't do anything. Have you called the police?" Margaret stared at the broken teacup, at the liquid spreading across her immaculate floor, just like her savings, seeping away into nothing. "Not yet. I was waiting for you, the other you, to call. They said not to tell anyone." "It was a scam, Grandma, a horrible, cruel scam." Tommy's voice broke again. "Stay on the line with me while I book a flight. Better yet, call Betty. Is she home? Call her right now." Betty, of course. Betty would know what to do. Betty, with her detective's mind and steady presence. But shame kept Margaret rooted to her chair. How could she admit to her friend, to anyone, that she'd been so thoroughly fooled? "I can't," she whispered. "I can't tell anyone. I'm so stupid, Tommy, so stupid, and stop that right now." Tommy's voice was fierce. "You're not stupid. You're the smartest, kindest person I know. These people, they're professionals. They do this for a living. They knew exactly how to manipulate you." The sound of rapid typing came through the phone. "Got it. I'm on the 2:30 flight. 3 hours. Please, Grandma, call Betty." "For me?" Margaret looked again at the mess on her floor. In all her years in this house, she'd never left a spill uncleaned, never left broken pieces scattered. It wasn't who she was. Slowly, something shifted inside her. The crushing shame began to transmute into something else, something harder, sharper. She thought of the scammer's voice, so carefully crafted to sound like Tommy, the calculated way they'd isolated her, used her love against her. "Actually," she said, her voice steadying, "I think I will call Betty, and the police, and the bank." She straightened in her chair. "And then I'm going to find out who did this." "Grandma, no one," she said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice, "gets to steal my life savings and just walk away." Through the phone, she heard Tommy catch his breath, recognizing the tone she'd used when he was small, the one that meant business, the one that meant she'd caught him in a lie or doing something dangerous. It was her librarian voice, her grandmother voice, her don't you dare voice, and for the first time since the teacup shattered, Margaret felt something other than shame. She felt fury. Betty arrived at Margaret's house exactly 12 minutes after receiving her call, still wearing her gardening gloves and tracking dirt on the immaculate welcome mat. She found her friend sitting ramrod straight at the kitchen table, surrounded by bank statements and a half-cleaned puddle of tea. "Start from the beginning," Betty said, pulling off her gloves. Her eyes, sharp as ever from 23 years of detective work, took in every detail of the scene. The broken teacup pieces collected in a neat pile. The phone set precisely in the center of the table. The slight tremor in Margaret's usually steady hands. Margaret recounted everything. The morning call, the wire transfer, the real Tommy's revelation. With each word, Betty's expression grew darker, her jaw tighter. When Margaret finished, Betty was already pulling out her phone. "First things first," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "We call the bank's fraud department, then the police. I still know people at the station who'll take this seriously." She paused, studying her friend's face. "And you're not going to like this part, but we need to tell James and Sarah." "Tommy's already called them," Margaret said quietly. "He's flying in this afternoon." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. The bank's fraud department was sympathetic but not optimistic. "These scammers usually route the money through multiple accounts," the representative explained. "We'll try to trace it, but..." The police were even less encouraging. Officer Rodriguez, a young man who couldn't have been much older than Tommy, took their statement with professional detachment. "Unfortunately, we see these cases all too often. The best thing to do is to report it to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. They track these patterns." "Patterns?" Betty's voice had the same edge she'd used during interrogations. "You mean you've had other victims, recent ones, in this area?" Officer Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "I can't discuss other cases, ma'am." "Can't or won't?" Betty leaned forward. "Because if these scammers are targeting our community, shouldn't the public be warned?" "Betty," Margaret touched her friend's arm. "He's just doing his job." But Betty wasn't finished. 23 years with the force, and this is how we treat elderly victims now, filing reports that go nowhere. She pulled out her retired detective's badge. She wasn't supposed to still carry it, but old habits died hard. "Call Detective Ramirez. Tell him Betty Morrison needs a favor." An hour later, they were sitting in Detective Ramirez's office, surrounded by case files. 6 similar cases in the past month, he admitted, spreading photos across his desk. All elderly victims, all contacted by someone claiming to be a grandchild in trouble. Total losses, over $500,000. Margaret studied the photos. Other grandparents, other broken hearts. "They knew things about Tommy," she said. "Personal details, the internship interview. How?" "Social media, probably," Detective Ramirez sighed. "These scammers do their homework. They monitor Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. They wait for posts about big life events, graduations, job interviews, travels. Then they strike when they have enough personal information to sound convincing. They also knew about my savings," Margaret added, "the exact amount." Betty's head snapped up. "That's not from social media, that's local information." Her eyes narrowed. "Who else knew about that money, Margaret? Just you, Tommy, James and Sarah, and the bank." Margaret paused. "When I made the transfer, the tellers seemed concerned, like they wanted to stop me. Sarah Chen and James Miller." Betty was already writing the names down. "They tried to warn you. Maybe they've seen this before." She turned to Detective Ramirez. "We need to look at bank employee records. Someone's feeding information to these scammers." Detective Ramirez held up his hands. "We can't just investigate bank employees without evidence. Then we'll find evidence." Betty cut him off. She turned to Margaret. "If you're willing to fight this, I'm willing to help, but it won't be easy. These scammers are sophisticated, organized. We'll be going up against professionals." Margaret thought of her empty savings account, of Robert's insurance money meant to secure their grandson's future, of other grandparents sitting in other kitchens, hearts breaking over other phone calls. "When I was head librarian," she said slowly, "someone stole books from the children's section, sold them online. Everyone said to let it go. They were just books, but I set up a sting operation with security cameras and caught them red-handed." She straightened her shoulders. "I may be old, but I'm not helpless, and I'm certainly not going to sit here and do nothing." The grandfather clock in. The hallway chimed 3 times. Tommy's flight would be landing soon. "Well then," Betty said, a familiar glint in her eye, the one that had solved dozens of cold cases over her career. "Let's get to work." Detective Ramirez looked between the 2 women and sighed, reaching for his phone. "I'll call the cyber crimes unit. Something tells me I'm going to need their help on this one." Tommy's arrival brought both comfort and a new dimension to their investigation. He walked through Margaret's front door at 7 p.m., laptop bag slung over his shoulder, his interview suit wrinkled from the flight. The moment he saw his grandmother, his professional demeanor crumbled, and they held each other for a long moment. "I should have warned you about these scams," he mumbled into her shoulder. "We covered them in my cybersecurity classes. I just never thought classes." Betty perked up from her position at the kitchen table, surrounded by case files. "You study cybersecurity?" Tommy pulled back from the hug, wiping his eyes. "It's my focus area. The internship I interviewed for, it's with a major security firm." He looked around at the scattered papers and Detective Ramirez's cards. "What have you found so far?" Betty quickly brought him up to speed while Margaret made fresh tea, this time managing not to drop anything. Tommy's face grew increasingly focused as he listened, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. "Wire transfers leave digital fingerprints," he explained, his screen reflecting in his glasses. "Every transaction creates metadata, timestamps, routing numbers, IP addresses. The scammers know this, so they usually bounce the money through multiple accounts, sometimes across different countries. But," he trailed off, frowning at his screen. "But what?" Margaret leaned over his shoulder. "The initial transfer was domestic. That's unusual. These scams typically route immediately through international banks to make tracking harder." He looked up at Betty. "You said you suspect inside information from the bank?" Betty nodded. "The scammers knew the exact amount in Margaret's account. That's not something you get from social media." Tommy's typing intensified. "I'm looking at similar cases reported to the Internet Crime Complaint Center. There's a pattern. All the victims were customers of regional banks in the Northeast. All knew the exact amount in their accounts, and all the transfers," he sat back, eyes wide, "they all went through the same initial routing number." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked. "It means," Betty said slowly, "that someone's coordinating these scams through a specific bank or financial institution." She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Detective Ramirez." Within an hour, their kitchen had become an impromptu command center. Detective Ramirez arrived with Lisa Chen from the Cyber Crimes Unit. "No relation to Sarah Chen at the bank," she assured them with a smile. Lisa and Tommy quickly fell into a rapid-fire technical discussion that left the others struggling to keep up. "The routing number belongs to a small processing company that handles transactions for regional banks," Lisa explained, displaying a complex diagram on her laptop. "Including First Regional. But here's where it gets interesting. 3 months ago, this company updated their security systems, which means they hired contractors," Tommy added. "Temporary workers with access to their networks during the transition." Margaret watched their faces illuminate with understanding. The inside information came from the processing company, not the bank. "It would explain how they knew account details from multiple banks," Betty mused. "But they still needed someone local to identify potential victims, someone who could tell them which accounts belonged to elderly customers with substantial savings." "Sarah Chen," Margaret said suddenly. "The teller. She tried to warn me. Maybe she's noticed a pattern too." Detective Ramirez was already reaching for his phone, but Betty stopped him. "Wait, if there is someone at the bank working with the scammers, we don't want to tip them off by asking official questions." "What are you suggesting?" Ramirez asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "I think it's time Margaret and I did some banking," Betty smiled. "I've been meaning to discuss my retirement account anyway." Lisa and Tommy exchanged glances. "While you're doing that," Lisa said, "we can trace the contractor connections from the processing company, cross-reference them with local banking staff, And I can write a program to analyze the transaction patterns, Tommy added. Look for commonalities in how they move the money after the initial transfer. Margaret sat quietly, watching her kitchen transform into a war room. Her grandson's fingers flew across his keyboard, his face set in concentrated lines that reminded her so much of Robert. Betty was already sketching out a plan for their bank visit, her detective instincts fully awakened. Lisa and Ramirez huddled over case files, building connections. Mom and Dad want you to come stay with them, Tommy said, quietly, during a lull in the planning. Just until this is sorted out, they're worried about you. Margaret thought of her son and daughter-in-law in Seattle, their comfortable guest room, their well-meaning protection. She thought of leaving her home, her routine, her fight. No, she said firmly, I'm not running away. These people didn't just steal my money. They stole my trust. They used my love for you as a weapon. She picked up the bank statement showing her empty account. I want to look them in the eye when we catch them. Tommy studied her face for a moment, then nodded. Okay, but I'm staying here with you. We all are, Betty added, not looking up from her notes. At least until we know you're safe. The security company can wait, Tommy said. Family comes first. Margaret felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the morning's devastated sobs. These were tears of gratitude, of determination, of strength gathering. The grandfather clock struck midnight, but no one suggested stopping. In the dim light of laptop screens and scattered desk lamps, Margaret's kitchen had become something else, a command center, a war room, a place where justice was being planned in careful, deliberate steps. The scammers had chosen the wrong grandmother to target. The next morning found Betty and Margaret dressed for their bank visit. Betty in a crisp blazer she'd retrieved from home, and Margaret in her best cardigan. They looked every bit the part of two elderly ladies discussing retirement accounts. Only the tiny microphone under Margaret's collar, courtesy of Lisa's cybercrimes unit, suggested anything unusual. Remember, Detective Ramirez had said during their morning briefing, we're just gathering information. Don't try to confront anyone. Now, walking into First Regional Bank, Margaret felt her heart racing. Sarah Chen was at her usual window, but they deliberately chose James Miller's line instead. As they waited, Betty chatted loudly about investment options, playing her role perfectly. I just don't know what to do with my pension. Betty sighed theatrically. After what happened to the Hendersons, did you hear about that? Terrible business. With their savings, James Miller's head lifted slightly, his fingers pausing on his keyboard. Back at Margaret's house, Tommy and Lisa huddled over their laptops, listening through the surveillance feed. Got movement on his computer, Tommy murmured. He's accessing something outside the bank's normal system. Margaret stepped up to the window. I'd like to discuss my accounts, she said, sliding her ID across the counter. All of them, James. Miller's face showed a flicker of recognition, quickly masked. Of course, Mrs. Wilson, I'm sorry about your recent transaction issues. Yes, Margaret said steadily, $149,000, my entire savings. You tried to warn me, didn't you, Mr. Miller? His eyes darted to the side and then back. I'm not supposed to discuss other customers' transactions. He's sending a message, Tommy reported through Margaret's concealed earpiece. Some kind of encrypted chat. Betty leaned in. We're not here about Margaret's transaction. Mr. Miller, we're here about all of them. The Hendersons, the Petersons, Mrs. O'Malley, 6 cases in 1 month, all elderly victims, all knowing exactly how much to ask for. James Miller's face had gone pale. He glanced at the security camera in the corner, then back at them. I don't know what you're talking about. Got it. Lisa's voice crackled in Margaret's ear. The chat program connects to a server in Estonia, same one used by the processing company contractors. Mr. Miller, Margaret said softly, leaning closer to the window. I'm not angry with you. I think you've been trying to help, in your own way, warning us when you could. But people are getting hurt. I lost my life savings. The Hendersons lost their retirement. How many more will there be? James Miller's hands were shaking now. He looked over at Sarah Chen's window, then down at his desk. When he spoke, His voice was barely a whisper. "They have my daughter." Betty's sharp intake of breath was audible. Through the earpiece, they heard Detective Ramirez curse softly. Not physically," Miller continued, still whispering. "But they have everything. Her social security number, her medical records, her school records. They showed me what they could do, how easily they could destroy her life, her future. Said they'd make it look like she'd committed financial crimes. She's only 19, just started college." "Mr. Miller," Betty said, her voice gentle but firm, "we can help, but we need to know everything." He shook his head. "You don't understand. These people, they're not just scammers. This is organized crime, international. They have people everywhere. Banks, processing companies, even some police departments. They call themselves the Shadow Brigade." Through the earpiece, Lisa whispered, "Shadow Brigade, known cybercriminal organization, suspected in multiple international fraud cases, but never caught. They approached me 6 months ago," Miller continued. "Said they knew about Emily, my daughter, knew she was starting college, knew about her scholarship applications. Said they could make all that go away with a few keystrokes. All I had to do was flag accounts. Elderly customers with large savings. Pass along the details." "And the warnings?" Margaret asked. "Trying to stop the transfers?" A tear rolled down Miller's cheek. "My small rebellion. Only thing I could do, but they're watching. They're always watching." "Got his chat logs." Tommy's voice came through. "Names, dates, account numbers, everything." "Mr. Miller," Betty said, "in about 30 seconds, Detective Ramirez is going to walk through that door with a cybercrimes unit. They've been recording everything. They have proof of the Shadow Brigade's threats against your daughter. If you help us, really help us, we can protect both of you." Miller's eyes widened. He glanced at the door just as Ramirez entered. "Lisa, close behind him." "Think about Emily," Margaret said softly. "What would she want you to do?" James Miller looked at his computer screen, then at the security camera, then back at Margaret. Something in his face changed, hardened with resolve. "The next transfer is scheduled for tomorrow," he said. "Mrs. Abigail Parker, savings of $200,000. They're going to call her at 9 a.m., pretending to be her granddaughter Claire. They'll say she's been in a car accident in Boston." "How do they choose the targets?" Betty pressed. "Social media monitoring team in Kiev. They track elderly people's connections, build profiles, then they wait for life events they can use. Graduations, job interviews, travel, anything that makes their story more believable. And the money. Multiple jumps, first to a domestic account to avoid immediate suspicion, then split into smaller amounts, routed through shell companies in Estonia, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands. Final destination is usually cryptocurrency, impossible to trace. Unless, Tommy's voice came through the earpiece, excited now, you have access to the initial routing protocols, which we now do, thanks to Mr. Miller's chat logs. Margaret watched James Miller's face, saw the years of fear and guilt warring with hope. She thought of her own grandson, of the love that had made her send that money without question. Miller had been trying to protect his daughter just as she had tried to protect Tommy. "Help us stop them," she said, "for Emily, for all the other families. They're hurting." Miller looked at Detective Ramirez, then back at Margaret. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his keyboard. "I'll tell you everything," he said. "Every account, every transfer, every name I know." Through the earpiece, Tommy's typing reached a fevered pace. "We've got them," he whispered. "We've finally got them." The first warning came at midnight. Margaret had just finished making up the guest room for Tommy when her home phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it, but some instinct made her reach for the receiver. "Hello, Margaret?" The voice was artificially distorted, yet somehow familiar. "Missing your savings account." Her blood ran cold. From the hallway she heard Tommy's footsteps approaching. "We know what you're doing," the voice continued. "James Miller was very naughty today. Very, very naughty. You should ask him how his daughter's scholarship applications are going. Oh, wait. They've all been mysteriously rejected." Tommy appeared in the doorway, just as Margaret's knees gave out. He lunged forward, catching her with one arm, while grabbing the phone with his other hand. But the line was already dead. Within 20 minutes, her kitchen was once again full of people. Detective Ramirez paced by the window while Lisa attempted to trace the call. Betty sat close to Margaret, her hand tight around her friend's. "They're trying to scare us off," Betty said firmly. "That means we're getting close. They've already started retaliating," Lisa reported grimly, looking up from her laptop. "Emily Miller's digital footprint has been completely corrupted. Fake credit card applications, suspicious bank accounts. Even her medical records show false drug addictions now." "Can you fix it?" Margaret asked. "Already working on it," Tommy replied from his own computer. "Everything they can do, we can undo. But this proves how sophisticated they are." A sharp knock at the door made everyone jump. Detective Ramirez drew his weapon, approaching carefully. Through the peephole, he saw a teenage girl with red-rimmed eyes. "Emily Miller," he said, opening the door. James Miller's daughter burst in, clutching her phone. "They're watching my dad's house," she sobbed. "There's a black van that's been circling the block for hours. Dad told me to come here, said to tell you they're closing accounts, destroying evidence." Lisa's fingers flew across her keyboard. "She's right. They're systematically shutting down their entire network. Within hours, we'll lose everything we gained from Miller's access." "Not everything," Tommy said. His face was illuminated by his screen, making him look older, harder. "I managed to grab their routing protocols before they started shutting down. We can still track the money, and more importantly, we can predict where the next transfer will go." "Mrs. Parker," Margaret remembered, "the transfer scheduled for tomorrow morning. We can't stop it without tipping them off that we're watching," Ramirez said. "But we can follow the money, set up a trap." Betty straightened in her chair. "You're thinking what I'm thinking. A reverse sting," Ramirez nodded. "But it's dangerous if they realize we're tracking them." Another call came through, this time on Margaret's cell phone. A different, distorted voice, but the same threatening tone. "Back off, grandmother. This is your only warning. We know where Tommy lives. We know his new job offer might not work out if certain allegations appear. Such a shame when promising. Young careers are ruined by cybercrime accusations." Margaret's hand tightened around the phone. She thought of James Miller, of his desperate attempts to protect his daughter. She thought of other grandparents, other families being torn apart by fear and manipulation. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "I want you to know exactly who you're dealing with. I spent 30 years as head librarian, organizing and protecting information. My best friend is a retired detective who'd never lost a case. My grandson is a cybersecurity expert who's already inside your systems. And you didn't just steal my money, you used my love for my grandson as a weapon." She took a deep breath. "So here's my warning to you. Return every penny you've stolen, or we're coming after you. All of us, and we won't stop until you're finished." The line went silent for a moment. Then, chillingly, laughter. "Oh, Margaret, you should have stuck to your books. Now you've made this personal." The call ended. Everyone in the kitchen stared at her. "They'll come after us hard now," Ramirez said, quietly. "Good," Margaret replied. "Let them come, because now we know something they don't." "What's that?" Emily asked, wiping her eyes. "They're scared." Margaret looked around her kitchen, at Tommy's determined face, at Betty's knowing smile, at Lisa's focused concentration. They wouldn't be making threats if they weren't scared, and people who are scared make mistakes. As if to prove her point, Tommy suddenly sat up straighter. "Got something. In their rush to close accounts, they left a back door open. I can see their next moves. All of them. Including," he smiled grimly, "including where Mrs. Parker's money is really going tomorrow." "Then we've got them," Betty said. "Not yet," Lisa cautioned. "They're still dangerous, maybe more dangerous now that they're cornered." Outside, a car drove slowly past Margaret's house. Everyone tensed, but it moved on. "We need to move you to a safe house," Ramirez started, but Margaret cut him off. "No, I'm not hiding. This is my home and I'm not leaving it. Besides," she added with a small smile, "they'll expect that. They'll expect me to run scared." "Then we stay too," Tommy said firmly. "All of us." Emily Miller looked around the kitchen at these strangers who were fighting not just for themselves, but for her father, for her future. "I want to help," she said. "They hurt my dad, used me to hurt him. I want to help take them down." Margaret reached out and took the girl's hand. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "we're going to do exactly that." The grandfather clock struck 1. In 8 hours, Mrs. Parker would receive a call about her granddaughter Claire. But this time, the Shadow Brigade wouldn't find a helpless victim. This time, they'd find a trap. Sarah Chen's hands shook as she placed the manila envelope on Margaret's kitchen table. It was 3 a.m., and the young bank teller looked like she hadn't slept in days. "I should have come forward sooner," she said, not meeting anyone's eyes. "But they threatened my family in Taiwan, said they had connections with local gangs there." Tommy opened the envelope, spreading out its contents. Account records, transaction logs, and most importantly, a list of names. Bank employees across 6 different branches who were working with the Shadow Brigade. "Marcus Wright," Betty read over his shoulder. "The regional manager?" Sarah nodded. "He's their main contact. He's been using his position to identify potential targets and coordinate with their tech team. The warnings I gave customers," she glanced apologetically at Margaret. "He wrote me up for those. Said I was interfering with legitimate transactions." Lisa was already running the names through her database. "Wright has no prior criminal record, but his spending patterns changed dramatically 6 months ago. Luxury car, expensive restaurants, private school tuition for his kids. That's when it started," Sarah confirmed. "He approached select employees, offered us a choice, help them or watch our lives fall apart. Most refused. Those who did," she swallowed hard. 3 of them had identity theft issues the next day. One had their medical records altered to show a history of drug abuse. Another had their child's college acceptance mysteriously revoked. Margaret thought of Emily Miller, of her father's desperate attempts to protect her. "But you kept warning people anyway." "My grandmother raised me," Sarah said simply. "Every time I saw another elderly person come in for a large transfer, I saw her face. I couldn't just watch it happen." Detective Ramirez studied the documents. "This is enough for a warrant. We can move on right first thing in the morning." "No," Tommy interrupted, looking up from his laptop. "These records prove something bigger. Look at the dates of Wright's first contact with the Shadow Brigade. 1 week after the processing company's security upgrade. He wasn't just helping them target victims, he was their way into the entire banking system." "The processing company," Lisa breathed. "Of course. They needed someone with regional manager clearance to approve the security certificates for their malware. That's how they've been accessing account information across multiple banks." Sarah nodded. "Wright bragged about it once, when he'd had too much to drink at a company party. Said he was part of something bigger than just local scams. Called it the future of wealth redistribution." "More like the future of prison," Betty muttered. "Well, we can't move on right yet," Tommy said. "Not until we trace the full extent of their network. If we spook him now, they'll just replace him with another insider." "Mrs. Parker's transfer is in 5 hours," Margaret reminded them. "If Wright is coordinating with their tech team, then he'll be monitoring it personally," Lisa finished. Which means, Detective Ramirez said slowly, "we might have a chance to catch both ends of the operation. The scammers and their banking insider." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I can help. Wright trusts me now, thinks his threats have kept me in line. I can get you his exact schedule, his protocols." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed the young woman's hand. You've been so brave, Sarah. But this is dangerous. If they catch you, like you said earlier, Sarah managed a small smile. They used my love for my grandmother against me, made me watch while they hurt other grandmothers. I want to make it right. The grandfather clock struck 3:30. In the growing pile of evidence on Margaret's kitchen table, a plan was taking shape. One that would require perfect timing, absolute precision, and more than a little courage from everyone involved. Well, Betty said, her detective's mind already mapping out the logistics. Let's make sure Marcus Wright's future includes a very different kind of wealth redistribution. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, index cards spread before her like battle plans. On each one, written in her precise librarian's hand, was a step in their counter-operation. 4 a.m., and the team was running on coffee and determination. It's elegant, really, Tommy said, reviewing their strategy. We're going to use their own system against them. The plan had come together like pieces of an intricate puzzle. Sarah Chen would return to the bank, maintaining her cover. She'd ensure Marcus Wright was in his office for the morning's transfer. Standard procedure for large transactions. Meanwhile, Lisa had already contacted Mrs. Parker, bringing her into their confidence. The grandmother would receive her call right on schedule, but this time they'd be ready. The money is the key, Lisa explained, pointing to her laptop screen. They've gotten cocky using the same routing protocols. When Mrs. Parker's transfer goes through, they'll split it up just like they always do. But this time, Tommy continued, we'll be tracking every division, every jump. More importantly, we'll have proof of Wright's direct involvement. He has to personally authorize the split transactions. Betty, who had been quiet for a while, spoke up. It's not enough just to catch them. We need to recover the money, all of it, not just Mrs. Parker's but everyone's. That's where I come in, Emily Miller said. She'd been working with Tommy, learning the basics of blockchain tracking. Dad's access codes are still valid for the next 12 hours. Once we identify their cryptocurrency wallets, we can freeze them, Tommy finished. Every last digital penny. Margaret studied the index cards, adding another to the sequence. And what about the ones who threatened us? The ones on the phone? Voice analysis is already running, Lisa assured her. The calls came through their secure system, but they had to connect through Wright's banking protocols. Once he logs in this morning, we'll have them. Detective Ramirez nodded. But Margaret, you need to understand. When they realize what's happening, they'll be desperate, dangerous. I'm counting on it, Margaret said calmly, adding another index card, because we're not just going to catch them. We're going to make sure they can never do this to another family again. The plan was audacious. Using Mrs. Parker's transfer as bait, they would track not just the money, but all the digital breadcrumbs leading back through the Shadow Brigade's network. Wright's login would give them access to the entire communication system. Every threat, every stolen dollar, every manipulated record, all of it would be exposed. Think of it like a library catalogue, Margaret had explained earlier, drawing on her years of experience. Every transaction is like a book. It has a history, a trail, of who touched it, where it's been. We just need to follow the cards back to the source. Now, looking at their battle plans spread across her kitchen table, she felt a fierce pride in this unlikely team. Sarah Chen, risking everything to make things right. Emily Miller, turning her fear into determination. Tommy, using his skills to protect others from what had happened to his grandmother. Betty, bringing her detective's instincts to one last important case. Dawn's coming soon, Betty noted, glancing at the lightening sky outside. Wright will be heading to the bank in a few hours. Then, let's make sure we're ready for him, Margaret said, placing the final index card in sequence. On it, she'd written, a simple message. Justice. The grandfather clock struck 4:30, its chimes echoing through the quiet house. In Margaret's neatly organized kitchen, a small army of justice was preparing for battle. They had index cards instead of weapons, laptops instead of shields, and determination instead of armor. But they also had something the Shadow Brigade didn't: the righteous anger of a grandmother who'd been pushed too far. The tables weren't just turning, they were about to be completely overturned. The pre-dawn hours ticked by with military precision. Margaret's kitchen had transformed into a command center, with laptops, cables, and surveillance equipment covering every surface. The smell of coffee mingled with the anxiety in the air as each team member prepared for their role. "Equipment check," Lisa announced, distributing earpieces and tiny microphones. "These are connected to a secure frequency. Unlike the scammers, we're not routing anything through the bank's systems." Sarah Chen was practicing her normal morning routine, the slight tremor in her hands the only sign of her nerves. "Right. Always arrives at 7:45. He'll expect me to have his coffee ready. It's how he keeps tabs on loyal employees. And I'll be in my usual spot at the drive-through window," James Miller added. He'd arrived an hour earlier, dark circles under his eyes but determination in his voice. He never suspects the quiet ones. Tommy and Emily sat shoulder to shoulder at their laptops, running final checks on their tracking software. "The moment Wright logs in, we'll have access to their entire communication network," Tommy explained. "Every call, every threat, every transaction, we'll see it all." "Mrs. Parker is ready," Detective Ramirez reported, hanging up his phone. "She's nervous but committed. Says she's doing it for her real granddaughter Claire." Betty was reviewing the index cards Margaret had created, committing every step to memory. "Once the transfer is initiated, we'll have exactly 12 minutes before their system starts splitting the money. That's our window." Margaret sat at the head of her kitchen table, watching her unlikely army prepare for battle. She thought of all the other grandmothers out there, love and fear warring in their hearts as they rushed to help grandchildren who weren't really in trouble. The familiar anger rose in her chest, but now it was focused, purposeful. "The safe word is catalog," Lisa reminded everyone. "If anything feels wrong, if you sense any danger, say it and we abort immediately." Sarah straightened her bank uniform, checking her appearance one last time. Wright likes to watch the big transfers from his office. He calls it supervising, but really, he's monitoring the split points. Which is exactly what we want him to. "Do," Tommy said. "The more he's involved, the more evidence we collect." Emily looked up from her screen. "Dad, are you sure about this? Once Wright realizes what's happening..." James Miller hugged his daughter. "I'm done being afraid of them. Done letting them use you against me." The grandfather clock struck 6, its chimes somehow more solemn than usual. Margaret began her own preparations, changing into her best church dress, the one she wore when she wanted to be taken seriously. As she fastened her pearl necklace, Betty appeared in the bedroom doorway. "You don't have to be there in person," her friend said softly. "We can monitor everything from here." Margaret shook her head. "Yes, I do. Wright needs to see me. They all need to see me. Need to know that we're not just faceless victims they can threaten and manipulate." She opened her jewelry box and removed Robert's wedding ring, which she wore on a chain around her neck. "Besides," she added, touching the ring for luck, "I was a librarian for 30 years. Nobody knows more about keeping things organized and following paper trails than I do." Back in the kitchen, final assignments were being given. Police units were discreetly positioning themselves around the bank. Cyber crimes teams were standing by. Mrs. Parker was preparing to receive her call. "Remember," Detective Ramirez said, "our priority is catching them in the act. We need digital proof of Wright's involvement, proof of the threats, proof of where the money goes. Once we have that, we take down the whole network," Lisa finished. "Not just the local operation, but the entire Shadow Brigade." Sarah and James prepared to leave first. They needed to be at the bank early, maintaining their usual routines. As Sarah reached the door, she turned back. "Thank you," she said to Margaret, "for showing me that standing up to them is possible." Margaret smiled. "Thank you for trying to warn me, even when you were afraid." The sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking over the horizon. In another hour, Marcus Wright would arrive at his office, smooth and confident in his expensive suit, never suspecting that his carefully constructed scheme was about to unravel. "They think they're the hunters," Betty said, watching Sarah and James drive away. "Time to show them what it feels like to be the prey." Marcus Wright's black Mercedes pulled into his reserved parking space at exactly 7:43 a.m. From their surveillance position across the street, Margaret and Betty watched him step out, straightening his Italian silk tie. "Right on schedule," Betty murmured into her microphone, looking quite pleased with himself. "That's about to change," Lisa's voice crackled through their earpieces. She was parked a block away in a cyber crimes van, monitoring all digital communications. "Tommy, how's our access?" Sarah planted the device perfectly, Tommy replied from Margaret's kitchen, where he and Emily were tracking multiple screens. "It's copying every keystroke on Wright's computer, the moment he logs in." Inside the bank, Sarah Chen's hands were steady as she placed Wright's coffee on his desk. Cream, no sugar, expensive Colombian blend. She'd already activated the tiny transmitter hidden beneath his desk drawer while cleaning earlier. "Good. Morning, Mr. Wright," she said. The perfect picture of a dutiful employee. Mrs. Parker called to confirm her appointment for 9 a.m. She said it was about her granddaughter Claire. Wright's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Excellent. Make sure she's shown directly to my office when she arrives." He settled into his chair, unaware of the device recording his every move. "He's logging in," Tommy reported. "First into the bank's system now. Yes, there it is. He's accessing their shadow network." Detective Ramirez's voice came through. "All units stand by. Remember, we need him to authorize the transfer before we move." Margaret sat straighter in the passenger seat of Betty's car, watching the bank's entrance. Other employees were arriving, including James Miller, his head down as usual. Everything looked normal. Too normal. "Movement on their network," Emily announced. "They're preparing for the call to Mrs. Parker, running their voice modulation software." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. "Betty," she whispered, "what if—" "Don't," Betty cut her off gently. "You're having second thoughts because you're a good person. But remember why we're here." Through their earpieces, they heard Mrs. Parker answer her phone right at 9 a.m., the scared voice claiming to be Claire. The rehearsed story about the accident in Boston. Mrs. Parker played her part perfectly, her voice trembling with just the right amount of grandmotherly concern. "He's watching the account," Tommy reported. Wright just opened Mrs. Parker's profile. $200,000, just like we thought. "Sarah?" Lisa's voice was tense. "What's he doing?" "Smiling," Sarah replied quietly, pretending to organize files nearby. "He just made a call, speaking in what sounds like Russian. Confirming with their tech team," Lisa translated. "Standard procedure before a big transfer." Margaret watched. The bank entrance, where Mrs. Parker had just arrived, clutching her purse. The elderly woman looked frightened, but her spine was straight as she walked inside. "Money's moving," Tommy announced. "Wright just authorized the first transfer, starting the trace now." Through their surveillance, they could hear Wright's smooth, professional voice greeting Mrs. Parker, explaining the wire transfer process, warning her about irrevocable transactions, his own twisted version of due diligence. "Got it," Emily suddenly said. "The first split points. Wait, something's wrong." "What?" several voices asked at once. "They're changing the routing," Emily reported, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "New patterns, different from their usual—" "They know," Tommy cut in, his voice sharp. "Somehow they know. They're rerouting everything. We're losing the trace." "Wright's making another call," Sarah whispered urgently. Margaret watched in horror as black SUVs began pulling into the bank's parking lot. Men in suits stepping out, hands suspiciously positioned under their jackets. "Catalog," Lisa barked into the comm system. "Everyone out now." But before anyone could move, Wright's voice came through their earpieces, smooth and amused. "Did you really think we wouldn't be watching for something like this? Margaret, I believe you know the voice I'm about to let you hear." There was a click, and a new voice filled their earpieces. Young, frightened, familiar. "Grandma?" Tommy's voice said, but it was impossible because Tommy was in her kitchen. Wasn't he? Grandma, they have me. They really have me this time. That's not Tommy, Margaret said, her voice steel hard despite her trembling hands. My grandson is in my kitchen. I can hear him typing through the earpiece. Are you sure? Wright's voice was silk smooth. Technology can do such amazing things. These days, voice modulators, digital mimicry, how do you know which Tommy is real? Betty's hand gripped Margaret's arm as they watched more black SUVs arrive. Lisa, she whispered, tell me you're tracking these vehicles. Already on it, Lisa replied. But Margaret's right. Tommy's signals are still coming from the house. This is another trick. Through their earpieces, they could hear the chaos unfolding. Sarah Chen had quietly stepped away from Wright's office. James Miller was slowly making his way toward the back exit. Mrs. Parker sat frozen in her chair, the transfer papers untouched before her. Enough games, Margaret said, opening her car door despite Betty's attempt to stop her. You want to face me? Fine, let's face each other. Margaret, don't... Several voices said at once, but she was already walking toward the bank entrance. Her spine straight, her grandmother's pearls gleaming at her throat. The men from the SUVs watched her, but didn't interfere. Inside, the bank was eerily quiet, other customers having been quietly escorted out minutes earlier. Wright stood in his office doorway, smiling like a cat who'd cornered a particularly interesting mouse. Mrs. Wilson, he said warmly, so good to see you again. Please come in, and do tell your friend Detective Morrison that those pearls are broadcasting quite clearly. Let's remove that earpiece, shall we? Margaret reached up and took out her earpiece, placing it on Wright's desk. Through it, she heard Tommy's voice, her real Tommy, saying, Don't worry, Grandma. We're still here. We're not leaving you. Now. Then, Wright settled behind his desk. Let's talk about how this ends. You've caused quite a bit of trouble, you know. Our organization doesn't appreciate interference. And I don't appreciate being robbed, Margaret replied, or threatened, or having my grandson's voice used against me twice now. Business is business, Wright shrugged. Nothing personal. Although I must admit, your little team impressed. Us, former detective, cybersecurity expert, determined bank employees. Quite the ensemble cast. It almost worked. It did work, Margaret said, because you just confirmed something we suspected. You have someone watching my house. How else? Would you know about Tommy typing right now? Wright's smile faltered, just for a moment. You also, Margaret continued, warming to her subject, just confirmed that you're using voice modulation technology, and that you're part of a larger organization, and that you've been monitoring all of us, which means... Tommy's voice came through the earpiece on the desk. We finally have access to your entire surveillance network. Thanks for that, by the way. The back door you used to watch us works both ways. Wright's computer chimed. His screen filled with scrolling data as Tommy and Emily began their real attack. Not on the money transfer system, but on the Shadow Brigade's entire communication infrastructure. By the way, Margaret added, allowing herself a small smile, 30 years as a librarian taught me something about organizing information, like keeping detailed records of every threat you made, every call you recorded, every account you stole from. My index cards made quite a nice evidence file for the FBI. You're bluffing, Wright said, but his hands were moving across his keyboard trying to stop the data breach. Am I? Margaret nodded toward his computer. Check your private accounts, the ones in the Caymans. Wright's face went pale as he pulled up his banking windows. Every account empty. Emily's father may have helped you move money in, Margaret said, but his daughter figured out how to move it back out. Quite poetic, really. Through the windows, police cars could be seen arriving, their lights silent, but their presence unmistakable. The men from the SUVs were already fleeing, their tough facades crumbling in the face of federal agents emerging from unmarked vehicles. It's over, Mr. Wright, Margaret said, standing up. You tried to use my love for my grandson as a weapon, but you forgot something important about grandmothers. And what's that? Wright asked, his composed mask finally cracking. We protect our own. And right now, that includes every other grandmother you ever tried to scam. The office door opened. Detective Ramirez entered, followed by federal agents. As they began reading Right His Rights, Margaret picked up her earpiece. "Tommy, could you be a dear and make sure Mrs. Parker's money is returned first?" After all, she did help us set this
trap.
The next few hours unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. From Margaret's kitchen, their unlikely command center, Tommy and Emily coordinated with cybercrimes units across 3 continents. The Shadow Brigade's network, laid bare by Wright's own surveillance backdoor, revealed everything. "London team confirms funds recovery," Lisa reported, her voice triumphant through the secure channel. 7 victims, all repaid. Sydney's reporting the same. Tokyo's processing now. Margaret sat in her familiar kitchen chair, Betty beside her, watching the numbers roll in on Tommy's laptop screen. Every account they uncovered, every victim they identified, every dollar returned, it all appeared in neat, organized columns that would have made any librarian proud. "Dad," Emily called from her screen. "Singapore police just arrested their banking contact. He was using the same protocols you were forced to use." James Miller, now providing evidence to federal agents in the living room, managed a small smile. "How many others like me do you think they threatened?" "Too many," Detective Ramirez answered, entering with fresh coffee. "But they're all coming forward now. Wright's arrest broke the dam. We've got bankers, tech workers, even a few police officers confessing to being blackmailed into helping them." Sarah Chen arrived from the bank, still in her uniform but standing taller now. "Wright's office is a gold mine. He kept records of everything, probably as insurance against his own organization. Files going back 3 years. Typical middle management," Betty snorted. "Always keep paperwork to cover yourself." Through the secure channel, they could hear operations unfolding across the globe. Police raids in Estonia, server seizures in Singapore, arrests in the Cayman Islands. The Shadow Brigade's entire infrastructure was collapsing, their own surveillance system turned against them. "Mrs. Henderson's funds are back in her account," Tommy reported, checking another name off their list. "Along with compensation for emotional damages. The Petersons too, and Mrs. O'Malley." Margaret watched the names scroll past, each one representing another family made whole. Her own savings had been among the first recovered, but that hardly seemed important now. What mattered were the dozens, no, hundreds of other grandparents whose love had been weaponized against them. Kiev team reports their social media monitoring center is shut down, Lisa announced. They found their targeting protocols, lists of potential victims, social media tracking data, everything. "Found their voice modulation server too," Emily added. "The one they used to fake Tommy's voice. And, oh," she paused, her face darkening. "Their files show they've done that over 2,000 times in the past year." Margaret thought of that first call, that voice that had sounded so much like her grandson. 2,000 other grandparents had received similar calls. 2,000 families manipulated by their deepest fears and strongest loves. "Got something else," Tommy said suddenly. "Their cryptocurrency wallets. Not just the recent ones, all of them. 5 years of stolen funds." His fingers flew across the keyboard. "Converting it back to cash now. It's over $50 million. The room fell silent. $50 million, Betty whispered. $50 million stolen from grandparents who just wanted to help their grandchildren. Not stolen, Margaret corrected her. Temporarily misplaced and now returned. She stood up, straightening her cardigan. "Is my statement ready for the press conference?" Detective Ramirez nodded. "FBI wants you to speak first. You're the face of this operation now. The grandmother who brought down an international crime syndicate." "The grandmother who had help," Margaret reminded him, looking around at her unlikely team. Sarah Chen, who had risked everything to warn victims. James and Emily Miller, turning their pain into purpose. Tommy, using his skills to protect others from what had happened to his family. Betty, bringing her detective's instincts to one last, crucial case. Lisa and Ramirez believing in them when no one else would. Her kitchen, usually so quiet and orderly, hummed with activity and purpose. The grandfather clock struck noon, its familiar chimes now marking not just time, but triumph. "Mrs. Parker is waiting outside," Sarah said softly. "She'd like to thank you. So would Mrs. Henderson and the Petersons. There's quite a crowd gathering." Actually, Margaret touched her grandmother's pearls, then Robert's ring on its chain. "Well then," she said, "let's go tell them that no one needs to be afraid of those phone calls anymore. Let's tell every grandmother out there that love is no longer a weapon that can be used against them." As she walked toward her front door, surrounded by her team, Margaret smiled. The Shadow Brigade had thought her an easy target, just another vulnerable old woman. Instead, they'd found a librarian who knew how to organize information, a grandmother who knew how to nurture justice, and a woman who knew that sometimes the most powerful force for change was simply refusing to be a victim. Their shadows were gone. Light had won. The press called it Operation Grandmother's Love. Headlines worldwide celebrated the takedown of the Shadow Brigade, but Margaret barely noticed them. She was too busy helping other victims recover, sitting with them in her kitchen, serving tea and understanding as they shared their stories. Marcus Wright faced federal charges along with dozens of other Shadow Brigade operatives. The evidence trail from his office led to arrests across 15 countries, but more importantly, it led to healing. Every victim's funds were restored, their dignity returned, their fear replaced with relief. Sarah Chen was promoted to head of security at First Regional Bank, implementing new protocols to protect elderly customers. James Miller and his daughter Emily started a cybersecurity consulting firm specializing in protecting seniors from scams. Tommy's interview led to a job offer, not just for him, but for his grandmother as well, teaching other banks how to spot and prevent elder fraud. The grandfather clock still chimed every hour in Margaret's kitchen, but now it often chimed over. The sounds of grateful families, planning meetings, and the quiet work of justice being served. Margaret's kitchen remained a gathering place, but now for different reasons. Every Tuesday, she hosted meetings for a support group she'd founded. Grandparents, helping grandparents protect themselves from scams. Betty was always there, bringing her detective's insight and fresh-baked scones. Tommy moved back east, taking a job that let him work remotely from his grandmother's house 3 days a week. Their Tuesday morning calls became Tuesday morning breakfasts, with Margaret teaching him her secret pancake recipe while he taught her about cybersecurity. The network they'd built during the investigation grew stronger. Sarah Chen brought her grandmother from Taiwan for an extended visit, and the two elderly women became fast friends, sharing stories and wisdom. Emily Miller started college again, this time studying criminal justice, inspired by Betty's mentorship. The grandfather clock, witness to so much, now kept time for new traditions, new friendships, new purposes. Margaret's life savings were restored, but she'd gained something far more valuable, a family that extended beyond blood, united by courage, justice, and the unshakable bond between generations. 1 year later, Margaret stood before a room full of elderly faces, their expressions alert and engaged as she taught her weekly class on scam prevention. Her index cards were now PowerPoint slides, courtesy of Tommy's technical expertise, but her librarian's precision remained unchanged. Behind her, the presentation showed a familiar image, her empty bank account from that terrible morning. But now it told a different story, one of triumph, of justice, of love turned from a weapon back into a strength. "Remember," she told her audience, fingering her grandmother's pearls, "they count on our love making us vulnerable, but love can make us strong too, strong enough to fight back, strong enough to protect each other." The grandfather clock in her kitchen would soon chime for another Tuesday morning breakfast with Tommy. Another day of making the world a little safer for grandmothers and their beloved grandchildren.